Welcome to Sacred SIJ. The sacrum is a sacred part of the body where the distribution of weight enters down through the sacrum and through the sacro-iliac joint, moves the weight hopefully evenly into the left and right pelvic bones and then down into the femur, in the legs and down into the feet. It's also a shock absorber, but it's also where the spinal cord exits the base of the spinal column. So where the nerve root passageways lead into the internal organs and down through the hips into the legs. When it is inflamed, it can present as a lower back pain, or maybe pain in the glute, or the hip, or even down into the leg. And it is often misdiagnosed as sciatica, or lower back condition, or disc herniation. So it's really important that you do see a professional so that you are diagnosed properly, as the treatment varies with these different conditions. For me, it shows up in the opposite side of my neck and shoulder before I even realise that it's sacro-iliac joint dysfunction. So essentially, starting from the base, foot placement combined with pelvic stability, so strengthening and toning around the pelvic floor, the deep transverse abdominis muscles, but also the glute medius muscles, stabilising the sides of the hips and the pelvis, along with mobility and stability of the hip joints and either side of the lower back. So this will help to improve sacro-iliac joint discomfort. And sacro-iliac joint dysfunction can often be due to a trauma, so a fall that you've taken on one hip, one knee, one foot, maybe even one side of the body. It can also be from multiple births, maybe hypermobility of the ligaments. It can come from repetitive action, a constant a rotation in one direction, and maybe a lift and a load with that rotation, or the standing on one leg, lifting and loading, so that weight distribution is not even. It can come from scoliosis, so the curvature of the spine where the muscles on either side of the vertebrae are different in their strength and tone, so the pelvis might have a hike on one side, maybe even a little bit of a rotation. It can come from leg length difference, so if the femur or the shin bones are of different length on one side, you may get that pelvic hike also. So ideally, by creating balance between the muscles on left and right sides of the body, around the hips, the pelvis, the spine, is going to help to maintain sacro-iliac joint. So if we create balance between the glute maximus, the piriformis, and the hip flexor, deep psoas, the glute medius, the glute minimus, if those muscles are in balance in their strength and tone, there's going to be stability through that hip and more mobility through that hip joint and that pelvic joint, but also between left and right sides. So we need to have the balance between the strength of the glutes on one side compared to the other, strength and tone, flexibility of the hip flexors, one side compared to the other, but also the lower back, so especially the erector spinae muscles and the quadratus lumborum muscles. If one side is tighter, one side's weaker, we might have a little rotation or that little hike happening through the pelvis, and that can impact sacro-iliac joint dysfunction and that load of the body weight distributing down into the legs and the feet. But also the balance between the hamstrings and the quadriceps can influence the sacro-iliac joint, and left and right sides, so the strength and tone of left and right hamstring, left and right quadricep. So it is a balance between the front and back of the body, but also left and right sides of the body, along with that stability coming from pelvic floor and deep transverse abdominis muscles that can help maintain the sacro-iliac joint. So things to avoid in your practice or even in your day-to-day life when sacro-iliac joint is acute, if it's inflamed there, is balancing on one leg. So you want to try and keep your weight even on both feet. So that includes getting out of the car. You would step out with both feet at the same time, place both feet on the earth, but avoiding things like your tree poses and your one-legged balances. You want to stick to Tadasana and maybe chair pose or Utkatasana with a block between the legs. So you've got pelvic floor activation, but the weight distributed evenly through the feet. Also fixed pelvis twists, so any seated twist where you might have your legs crossed or legs entangled, or even as I am now in Virasana, coming into a twist would create torsion around the sacroiliac joint because the pelvis is fixed. Better off to be doing twists when you're laying on your back and also with knees and feet parallel. We want to avoid deep back bends, so deep hyperextension of the lower back, such as upward facing dog. And also any standing poses where the feet are asymmetrical, so such as your warrior two, where your feet and knees are not so much parallel. We do want to try and keep feet and knees parallel. The placement of the foot wherever the heel is turned governs the position of the sit bone, so that creates the shape and the angle in the sacro-iliac joint. So when the heels are turned in and the toes are turned out, the bottom of the sacro-iliac joint is compressed and the top of the sacro-iliac joint is open. So like a pair of butterfly wings, feet turn out, sacro-iliac joint opens through the top and the hips turn out. When the feet turn in, toes turn in, heels turn out, the sit bones turn out, and the base of the sacroiliac joint is opened and the top, like butterfly wings, are wrapping inwards when the heels are turned out. So we do need to adjust the way we're using our feet when there is an acute sacroiliac joint dysfunction. An poorly practiced warrior one is probably one of the most sacroiliac joint dysfunction causing poses for most yogis. Because without that pelvic stability or the use of the hips in the rotation and the changing of the angle of that back foot can cause that compression at the base of the sacroiliac joint in the back leg. So perhaps even working with more of a crescent lunge where the feet are parallel and that back heel is off the floor rather than that back heel turning in to create that compression in the sacroiliac joint. Feet parallel is going to keep the sacroiliac joints more aligned and give you a little bit more of that weight distribution coming down from through the spine into the pelvis when you're in that more aligned foot position. Okay, so you might find that a block and there's micro bands, preferably a lighter one if you are a little acute, that these are going to become your new best friend in this Sacred SIJ series. So when you're working with standing postures such as Tadasana, which we practice in our Asana Addict with a block in Tadasana, where we want to have feet parallel. So just noticing if you do have that habit of turning the toes out when you stand, you're turning those heels in, the sit bones in, and it might be creating that compression at the base of the sacroiliac joint. By lining up the outer edge of the feet with the edges of the mat, and we create that little bit of tone coming up through the core without clenching the glutes. So we might tone through pelvic floor with just that subtle squeeze on the block. And then the same thing with your Utkatasana, with your chair pose, you might choose to do it with a block in your practice. And probably a foam block can be a little bit more comfortable and less heavy than the cork block. So if you have got a foam one, use one of those. So Utkatasana and Tadasana with a block instead of one-legged balances such as your tree pose. Maybe as there is less pain or discomfort in the sacroiliac joint, you might practice with your tree pose with the foot still on the floor. So you're still working with that distribution of your weight coming down through both the sacroiliac joints instead of floating that one foot off the floor so you're not going to aggravate one side. And then you've also got, you're wanting to keep your feet and knees parallel at all times. So you're going to keep that distribution of the weight, but also the heels are staying in that parallel position with the feet. So instead of your warrior twos, your warrior ones, you might use Padottanasana where your feet are parallel and you raise the arms out instead of turning the heels and the feet and creating that torsion and rotation through the sacroiliac joint. Same with your Trikonasana. So keeping your feet in more of your Padottanasana placement, and then you might make a lateral movement with the body, just a lateral Trikonasana, instead of changing the placement of your feet. So that could be the variation of Trikonasana. And with your Warrior One, as I mentioned before, having your feet parallel more into your crescent lunge position. So Warrior One being the heel dropping in of that back foot, which creates that little bit of torsion around that back leg sacroiliac joint. Staying in more of a crescent lunge where your feet are aligned and you've got that back heel in line with your middle toe. So that way you're lining up sacroiliac joint. You're drawing the sit bones together so you've got stability coming up through the base, through pelvic floor, and that little bit of tone around the lower belly. And then with your forward folds, so even your Uttanasana, sticking to have that block in between the thighs, so that when you fold forward, you've got that stability coming up through the core, but also an awareness that you are using your feet evenly, and you're giving that block a little bit of a squeeze so that stabilization is coming around that sacroiliac joint area by squeezing the block. And the same goes for if you're laying, or you're seated rather, and you're going to come into a forward fold. Maybe you might still like to have the block in between the thighs. Put the block between your legs whenever you can for sacroiliac joint dysfunction is my suggestion. So if you're coming into a forward fold, perhaps it's head to knee pose, Janusasana. I would recommend keeping feet and knees parallel. So this one's to avoid, make it Paschimottanasana. Feet and knees are parallel, so you're folding forward into your Paschimottanasana instead. And then with your twists, when you might have cross-legged seated, or even your Mrishi Asana seated, much better off to do any of your twists, laying on your back, having your ankles and knees together, and even better, having something between your knees again. So if you want to put a folded blanket or even a soft bolster, just a pillow, and coming into your twists with knees parallel, so that way the back of the sacrum, sacroiliac joints parallel, and the rotation comes up into the spine. And you might even need a little bit of support against the outside of the legs if there is quite a lot of tension and inflammation around the joint and into the lower back. So just that little bit of support so there's no tugging. And what you will find come up in a lot of the practices, especially this Series 1 practice, which is my go-to for whenever my sacroiliac joint is having a little bit of an inflame, is that our functional pelvic patterns, where we're laying on the back, feet, knees are hip width apart, only functional pelvic pattern 1 and 2, where you're rocking forward and back, working with your sit bones as they spread apart, and then sit bones come together, is going to create more tone through your pelvic floor. So you're lessening the overuse of glutes, psoas, and even those QL muscles in the lower back by maybe starting to micro move the pelvis with sit bones coming together and then wider apart. But just avoiding any of that rotational movement where we move into the third functional pelvic pattern where there's rotation and then leading through the knee, but also that lateral lazy Susan movement. If you are inflamed, you might find that little bit of tugging on the lower back might be uncomfortable, but maybe a gentle version of that lazy Susan one might be suitable. But just no rotation while you are inflamed. And then the other one that we bring in plenty of times is, of course, the block. Doing a little block squeeze. You might find when you do any abdominal work where you might be using the block between your legs or even your bridge lifts, that by turning your heels out slightly and just going that little bit pigeon toe, you've broadened the sacroiliac joints, and that may be quite a relieving position for you to then work work with your block squeeze and even your bridges, especially if you have had that habit of turning the heels in and the toes out and compressing the sacroiliac joint at the base. So we've got these block squeezes that we're working with, building up a bit more strength and tone through pelvic floor and deep transverse abdominis. And another one that I love coming into is a supported bridge, where resting that flat block underneath the sacrum and then letting the weight of your feet and your legs, letting that weight of pelvis drop into the block. It's like you're using gravity to balance out sacroiliac joints, pelvis, left and right side. So if there's any twist or rotation or any hiking, you can just let the weight of your pelvis, the body melt. This is my go-to pose if it's being inflamed at all. And another way of doing this same thing, where you're getting the balance of the sacroiliac joint, left and right pelvis, is to put legs up the wall or legs up onto the couch. So if you want to put your bottom up against the wall, and then maybe your legs go up onto the couch or up against the wall, and you're using the weight of the legs to settle down that weight into the pelvis and into the hips to create a little more symmetry. And this can be really useful if you have scoliosis or leg length difference. It's a really nice relief to be off the feet and have that gravity coming down into the hips. And the last one that I will be working with you, one that has helped me greatly, is with these booty bands, and in particular crab walking, which is where we place the booty band. If we are a little more acute, we've got that lighter band, and maybe it's going to come around the thighs to make it gentler. Or you might have it around your ankles, and it's going to start to make it a little bit stronger, but the closer it is to the joint, the less tension or strain it's going to place on the joint. We've got those feet parallel, and we're marching along in our little crab walk so that we create that strength and stability through the glute medius muscles that stabilize the pelvis. And this one's really important that we have got those feet parallel, so we're not coming into any of our habits of turning those heels out or in and changing the angle around that sacroiliac joint. So I hope this series is able to provide you with some relief and a little maintenance program that you can work with, but also some options that you have in your practice, in classes, so you can modify for your needs. I look forward to working with you. Namaste.